Marcus Webb thought his federal badge meant British protocol didn't apply to him. He was wrong. When the Royal Guard refused to step aside, Webb's frustration boiled over into something unthinkable. He drew his service weapon in front of hundreds of tourists. The crowd gasped as phones captured every second of the unfolding crisis. What happened next was a masterclass in why some men cannot be moved, no matter what you point at them. Within 90 seconds, silent palace units emerged from concealed positions, surrounding Webb in a display of precision that would shatter his confidence forever. This is the story of how Lance Corporal Tristan Hail, a combat veteran from Afghanistan, turned Webb's moment of arrogance into his greatest humiliation. But to understand how it all went so wrong, we need to start with the man who believed authority was something you could simply carry in your wallet. And if you're into stories where ego meets its reckoning, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. This one's just getting started. Marcus Webb stepped off the government transport at Heathrow with the kind of confidence that comes from never hearing the word no. His leather shoes clicked against the terminal floor with measured precision as he straightened his charcoal suit jacket and checked his watch. In his mid-30s, Webb had spent 15 years in federal service, and those years had taught him one simple truth: flash the badge, state your business, and watch obstacles disappear. Airport security waved him through without a second glance. Customs officials nodded respectfully at his credentials. Even the British immigration officer had stamped his passport with unusual speed after seeing the official letterhead on his documents. Webb's colleagues back in Washington knew his reputation well. He was the man they sent when bureaucratic niceties threatened to slow down important work. His signature approach had become legend in federal circles: credentials first, explanations later, results always. This method had opened doors from Miami drug raids to Moscow diplomatic meetings. The technique worked because most people, when faced with official authority, chose compliance over confrontation. The briefing folder in his carry-on bag contained detailed notes about British protocol and palace procedures. Webb had skimmed the pages during his flight, noting the bureaucratic instructions about strict adherence to established channels and proper diplomatic procedures. The language struck him as elaborate formality that governments use to justify their own existence. Real work happened when people cut through the ceremony and addressed problems directly. His mission timeline demanded efficiency, not pageantry. He had no idea that tradition harbored its own defense. Webb adjusted his tie with practiced movements, the same careful attention to detail that had served him in countless high-stakes meetings. His appearance was part of his authority: pressed shirts, polished shoes, and a bearing that suggested competence and control. These visual cues had opened more doors than any verbal explanation ever could. People responded to confidence, and Webb had learned to project it even when facing uncertain situations. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from his superiors, each notification adding pressure to his already tight schedule. The mission parameters left no room for delays or diplomatic dancing. Webb's handlers had made it clear that time was critical, and every hour spent navigating British formalities was an hour that could compromise their objectives. This urgency fed his natural impatience with anything that resembled obstruction or delay. The taxi ride through London gave Webb his first glimpse of the Royal Guards through tourist photographs displayed on phone screens around him. Passengers excitedly showed pictures of the red-uniformed figures standing motionless at palace gates, treating them like living museum pieces or elaborate street performers. Webb saw exactly what they saw: costumed actors playing roles in an outdated ceremony. The idea that these decorative soldiers could represent any real obstacle to his mission struck him as almost comical. Webb's worldview had been shaped by results, not traditions. He measured success by outcomes achieved and problems solved, not by adherence to ancient protocols that served no practical purpose. His federal training had emphasized adaptation and improvisation, skills that had served him well in diverse environments around the globe. The notion that ceremonial guards could somehow impede legitimate government business seemed like a relic from a bygone era. The fatal flaw in Webb's thinking lay in his confusion between having authority and being authoritative. His badge and credentials granted him certain legal powers within specific jurisdictions, but he had begun to believe that these tools made him inherently commanding rather than simply officially empowered. This distinction had never mattered before because most people chose to respect his position rather than test its limits. As the taxi approached the ornate gates of Buckingham Palace, Webb felt the familiar surge of confidence that preceded successful operations. The crowds of tourists with their cameras and guidebooks reinforced his impression of the palace as a kind of elaborate tourist attraction rather than a functioning seat of power. Webb paid the taxi driver and stepped onto the sidewalk, straightening his jacket one final time before approaching the palace entrance. The red-coated figure standing at the gate would simply need to understand that some business took precedence over traditional formalities. What Webb couldn't see was the man beneath the uniform. Lance Corporal Tristan Hail embodied something far more dangerous beneath his red wool uniform. The 28-year-old guard had begun his day at 4:30 in the morning with the same routine that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Afghanistan's deadliest provinces. His eyes swept the crowd in systematic patterns, a habit forged in Helmand where failing to spot movement in your peripheral vision could mean the difference between returning home and being carried out in a box. Hale's breathing followed the controlled rhythm he had learned during extended watches in forward observation posts, where enemy snipers waited for any sign of inattention or weakness. Each breath was measured and deliberate, feeding oxygen to muscles that remained coiled and ready despite their apparent stillness. His chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, the same steady pattern that had carried him through rocket attacks and mortar rounds that landed close enough to shake the ground beneath his boots and sprayed dirt across his face. The weight of his ceremonial rifle felt familiar in his grip, not because of parade ground drilling, but because muscle memory from real firefights had trained his body to maintain perfect balance under pressure. His left hand maintained contact with his weapon in a way that tourists mistook for formal positioning, but was actually tactical readiness disguised as ceremony. The micro-movements in his fingers revealed years of training where weapons were tools of survival rather than symbols of tradition. Tourists clicked their phone cameras rapidly, capturing what they believed were images of a living statue or elaborate street performer. They had no idea they were photographing a decorated combat veteran who had faced down Taliban fighters in close-quarters battles where split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. These same fingers that now gripped ceremonial steel had once written letters to the girlfriend of a young trooper named Davies, who had died in Hale's arms after an IED explosion tore through their convoy on a dusty Afghan road. Hale's service record contained moments when his ability to stand his ground had meant the difference between his unit's survival and complete catastrophe. During one particular engagement, his refusal to abandon his position while under heavy fire had allowed his squad to evacuate wounded comrades and establish a defensive perimeter that held until reinforcements arrived. The commendations for that action now sat quietly in his modest London flat, gathering dust while their owner performed duties that civilians dismissed as elaborate theater. His peripheral vision constantly tracked movement patterns in the crowd around him, identifying potential threats with the same systematic scanning that had kept him alive during ambushes and surprise attacks. A child running toward the gates registered as movement requiring assessment. A tourist reaching quickly into a backpack triggered automatic threat evaluation protocols. He noticed every detail, though not yet what would really matter. These responses happened below the level of conscious thought, programmed into his nervous system by training that went far beyond ceremonial drills and uniform inspections. The stillness that impressed onlookers was not performance art or disciplined posturing, but the same controlled calm that had allowed him to sleep through rocket attacks while remaining instantly alert when his watch began. This was the composure of a man who had learned to distinguish between sounds that meant danger and those that meant safety, who could remain motionless for hours while internally tracking dozens of variables that might indicate incoming threats. Hale's eyes registered the approach of a man in a charcoal suit whose bearing and movement patterns immediately marked him as someone accustomed to having his way. The guard's training allowed him to assess the approaching figure's confidence level, stress indicators, and potential for aggressive behavior without shifting his gaze or altering his ceremonial stance. Years of reading body language in hostile environments had given him skills that extended far beyond recognizing enemy combatants to identifying anyone whose intentions might disrupt the peace he was sworn to maintain. The dramatic irony reached its peak as Webb closed the distance between them, seeing only red fabric and brass buttons where a combat veteran waited with the patience of someone who had learned that survival often depended on refusing to be moved regardless of what threats others might deploy. Webb's federal credentials and practiced intimidation techniques were about to encounter something they had never faced before, a man whose courage had been tested under actual fire and proven unshakable. The stage was now set for a collision between assumed authority and earned respect, with hundreds of witnesses holding cameras ready to capture the moment when misconceptions about ceremonial duty would meet the reality of military discipline forged in combat. Webb approached with the practiced authority of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He flashed his federal badge and said, "I need you to shift position," his voice containing the same measured confidence that had opened doors from federal buildings to foreign embassies. The request seemed perfectly reasonable to him, simply asking a decorative guard to move so that important business could proceed without delay. But Hail's complete silence created an unexpected void in the conversation, a gap that Webb's federal training had never prepared him to fill. The guard's lack of response triggered Webb's standard escalation pattern, but his professional playbook had never equipped him for someone completely unimpressed by federal power. He had dealt with reluctant customs officials, stubborn bureaucrats, and uncooperative witnesses, but they had all eventually responded to his credentials and authority. Hail's unwavering stillness represented something entirely foreign to Webb's experience, a person who seemed unmoved by official demands and immune to intimidation tactics that had never failed before. Webb raised his voice slightly, adding edge to his tone. "I'm a federal agent on official business. I need access to this entrance immediately." His words echoed off the palace walls, but Hail remained as motionless as the stone lions flanking the gates. The guard's eyes stared straight ahead, his breathing remained steady, and his grip on his rifle never shifted. This complete lack of acknowledgement began to crack Webb's professional composure in ways that hostile foreign agents and dangerous criminals never had. The crowd of tourists began to notice the one-sided confrontation unfolding before them. Phones emerged from pockets and purses as voices grew curious and concerned. Bystanders whispered protocol explanations to each other, their murmurs reaching Webb's ears with corrections about centuries-old traditions that applied to everyone without exception. These civilian corrections struck Webb like physical blows, his authority being undermined not by trained professionals but by ordinary tourists with basic knowledge of British customs. The growing audience of phone cameras captured every moment of his mounting frustration, transforming what should have been a simple request into a public spectacle that threatened to damage his professional reputation. The crowd's gasps filled the air the instant Webb's frustration escalated, their collective intake of breath marking each moment his composure slipped further away. Webb's frustration boiled over into personal attacks that revealed the true nature of his character. He jabbed a finger toward Hail's chest and said, "I bet you wouldn't last 10 minutes on a real beat dealing with actual criminals instead of posing for tourist photos." The insults flowed freely as Webb's mask of professionalism slipped away, exposing a man whose power depended entirely on others backing down when confronted with his authority. But Hail remained unmoved, his silence more powerful than any response could have been. The crowd's disapproval became palpable as Webb's behavior grew increasingly aggressive. Children were pulled closer to their parents, and conversations stopped as tourists watched the American agent lose control in front of a guard who refused to be intimidated. Webb's professional training should have warned him about the dangers of public confrontations, but his ego had overridden his judgment completely. The moment Webb's hand moved toward his jacket marked the point of no return. The movement was too practiced, too familiar, revealing the presence of a shoulder holster and the service Glock that rested within it. The crowd gasped as they recognized the implications of his gesture, and several people began backing away from what had suddenly become a potential crime scene. Phone cameras focused more intently as the confrontation crossed from verbal intimidation into physical threat. Hale's complete stillness in the face of an armed threat demonstrated the vast gulf between Webb's bluster and genuine courage. The guard did not flinch, step back, or even blink as Webb's weapon cleared its holster. His training had prepared him for circumstances far more challenging than an agitated American with a handgun, and he remained steady under pressure that would have broken lesser men. Webb's decision to draw his weapon represented his ultimate failure as a federal agent and as a man. The act proved that he had never possessed real authority, only the illusion of it created by others' willingness to comply with his demands. True authority commanded respect through competence and character, not through threats and intimidation. Hale's unwavering stance exposed this fundamental weakness in Webb's approach to power. What Webb couldn't see was that his desperate gambit had already triggered responses far beyond his comprehension. The moment Webb's Glock cleared its holster, quiet, urgent tones triggered throughout the palace complex with mechanical precision that would have impressed even seasoned federal agents. Security cameras that tourists never noticed swiveled to track the threat while hidden sensors measured distances and calculated response vectors. Webb had drawn his weapon thinking it would force compliance from one ceremonial guard, but he had actually activated a defensive network that had been refined through decades of protecting the British Crown from far more dangerous threats than frustrated American bureaucrats. Armed palace response units materialized from concealed positions with movements so coordinated and silent that Webb barely registered their approach until it was far too late. Their silence proved more intimidating than any sirens or shouted commands could have been, demonstrating a focus on controlled action that went far beyond anything Webb had experienced in his federal career. Webb's single handgun represented a relatively minor challenge compared to the threats they were designed to handle. Within 90 seconds of Webb's weapon-clearing leather, the palace grounds transformed into a tactical containment zone that demonstrated the vast difference between federal training and military precision. Multiple matte black Range Rovers with discrete markings appeared from directions Webb had never considered, their positioning calculated to block escape routes and prevent any movement toward sensitive areas. The lead vehicle stopped exactly 20 meters away, a distance that allowed for optimal response, while maintaining tactical advantages that Webb's law enforcement background had never taught him to recognize. Webb's weapon, meant to intimidate one immovable guard, now faced multiple trained operators whose discipline made his federal credentials look like amateur theater. These men moved with the quiet confidence of professionals who had spent years preparing for moments exactly like this one. Their weapons remained holstered but ready, their positioning flawless, their communication silent but clearly coordinated through years of joint training that went far beyond anything Webb had experienced in his federal career. Captain Hannah Rhee emerged from the lead vehicle with an authority that immediately commanded attention from everyone present, including Webb himself. She paused and stepped closer, her movement deliberate and controlled, before her voice cut through the chaos with calm precision as she addressed the American agent directly. The tourists' panic revealed the true magnitude of Webb's miscalculation, as parents grabbed children and visitors scrambled for safety, transforming what had been a peaceful morning into an international incident captured by dozens of phone cameras from multiple angles. The captain's words carried weight that Webb's earlier shouting had never possessed. "You have 30 seconds to place your weapon on the ground and step away from it," she said, her military bearing evident in every syllable. Her tone contained no anger or excitement, only the measured confidence of someone who had dealt with armed threats as part of her professional routine. This was authority earned through competence and proven under pressure, not authority assumed through credentials and intimidation. Webb's realization dawned in stages as he took in the coordinated response surrounding him on all sides. His federal training had taught him to project confidence and maintain control, but nothing had prepared him for facing actual military precision deployed against him personally. The palace security team demonstrated capabilities that made his tie-knotting skills and credential-flashing techniques seem laughably inadequate by comparison. Throughout the entire armed confrontation, Hail remained absolutely motionless at his post, his rifle in ceremonial position, his eyes fixed straight ahead. His continued stillness became the most powerful statement of all, proving that true strength required no demonstration or acknowledgement of threats. While Webb waved his weapon and demanded recognition, the guard simply endured, embodying the discipline that had kept him alive through real combat in Afghanistan. The surrender happened in stages as Webb's federal authority crumbled against the reality of being outgunned and outclassed on foreign soil. His hand opened first, allowing the Glock to clatter against the cobblestones with a sound that echoed off the palace walls. His arms rose above his head in the universal gesture of defeat, completing his transformation from confident federal agent to cautionary tale. Captain Rhee's final words delivered the crushing truth that would haunt Webb long after his arrest. "You came here today thinking that authority came from your badge and your weapon," she said, as palace security collected his credentials and weapon. "But real authority doesn't come from what you carry, it comes from what you can endure." The lesson was complete, but the story was far from over as phone cameras continued recording every moment of his humiliation. 16-year-old Emma Richardson from Manchester held her phone steady, capturing what would become the defining moment of the entire confrontation. Her camera focused not on the defeated American agent, but on Lance Corporal Hail, who remained perfectly motionless at his post throughout the chaos. The guard's unwavering stance, rifle held in ceremonial position, eyes fixed straight ahead, became the image that would define the story for millions of viewers worldwide. Emma's simple caption when she posted the video later that evening read, "Today I learned what real courage looks like." The crowd's spontaneous applause for Hail marked a rare moment when ordinary people recognized genuine courage over flashy displays of authority. Tourists who had initially been frightened by Webb's weapon now clapped and cheered for the guard who had refused to be intimidated. Parents pointed out the guard to their children, explaining how real strength looked different from what they saw in movies. An elderly veteran in the crowd wiped tears from his eyes as he watched a young soldier demonstrate the kind of discipline that had once defined his own generation. Within hours of Emma's upload, the video had been shared across every major social media platform, creating competing narratives about American authority versus British tradition. News outlets picked up the story with headlines that ranged from supportive to critical, but the images spoke louder than any editorial commentary. The stark contrast between Webb's aggressive posturing and Hail's calm composure needed no explanation or analysis. Viewers could see for themselves which man had demonstrated real strength under pressure. Comments poured in from veterans around the world, sharing their own stories of choosing restraint over retaliation when faced with impossible situations. A Marine from California wrote about standing his ground during a riot in Baghdad when retreat would have meant abandoning civilians. His detailed account described maintaining position while bottles and rocks flew overhead, knowing that any movement backward would expose the Iraqi families sheltering behind his squad's defensive line. This story reinforced the same message that Hail had demonstrated. True strength came from enduring pressure rather than applying it. The American Embassy's statement of regret arrived within hours, expressing deep concern about the incident and promising a thorough investigation into Webb's conduct. The lengthy press release included apologies to the British government and assurances that such behavior did not represent American values or professional standards. In sharp contrast, the palace maintained dignified silence beyond a brief confirmation that security protocols had functioned as designed. This difference in communication approaches highlighted the cultural gap between reactive American crisis management and traditional British reserve. Webb's public humiliation became a teaching moment about the fundamental difference between having power and earning respect through consistent character. Social media users dissected every moment of his confrontation with Hail, pointing out how his assumed authority had crumbled the moment it encountered genuine discipline. Comment sections filled with observations about how quickly borrowed power disappeared when it faced principles that could not be bought, threatened, or intimidated. Tourists who witnessed the confrontation in person carried away memories that would influence their understanding of courage for years to come. They had seen a man threatened with a deadly weapon choose duty over self-preservation, tradition over personal safety. Tour guides reported that visitors asked different questions about the Royal Guards after the incident, wanting to know about their military backgrounds rather than just their ceremonial duties. The confrontation had transformed public perception of what the red uniforms actually represented. The lasting impact showed in changed perspectives as millions of viewers learned that the strongest choice was often refusing to be moved regardless of pressure or threats. Parents used the video to teach children about standing up for principles even when it seemed easier to give in. Teachers incorporated the story into lessons about character and integrity. The simple image of Hail remaining at his post while chaos erupted around him became a symbol of quiet strength that resonated across cultures and generations. The story's lessons about authority and respect would prove more valuable than any credential or badge could ever be. Webb's federal badge, meant to open every door, instead opened his eyes to the limits of assumed authority when it meets earned respect. His credentials had worked in countless situations before, but they crumbled against a man who could not be bought, threatened, or moved. The confrontation proves that real strength isn't about what you carry in your holster or your wallet, but what you can endure without breaking your principles or abandoning your post. Next time you face someone trying to intimidate you with their position, remember Lance Corporal Hail standing motionless while chaos erupted around him. Sometimes the most powerful response is quiet strength. Tell us below, when have you faced empty threats, and how did you respond?